Story 1. The disappearance of Flight 118 was supposed to be a straightforward case. A commercial airliner flying from LA to Denver lost contact mid-flight. It's not uncommon for planes to vanish in a massive country like ours, but this case turned out to be anything but ordinary. It started with a pilot's final transmission. The pilot reported seeing a city made of static floating in the clouds just before the plane lost contact. The transmission abruptly ended. It was one of those reports that made you pause, not just because of the odd phrasing, but because of the eerie calm in the pilot's voice. The way he spoke made it sound like he was seeing something real, not just some glitch in the cockpit instruments. When the wreckage was finally located in the Mojave Desert, the first thing that struck me was the sheer oddness of it. The plane wasn't scattered over a large area as you'd expect from a crash. It was almost as though the aircraft had collapsed inward, breaking apart in a way that defied the laws of physics. The remains were confined to a small, localized area, leaving no debris trail in the desert sand. I made my way to the crash site with the investigation team, but the most unsettling part wasn't the wreckage. It was the bodies. Most of the 119 passengers and crew were dead, and the rest were heavily wounded, but not in a typical plane crash way. The bodies were found in various positions, as though they had been frozen in time. But what stood out was how each body looked. Aged. The passengers weren't just dead, they were decades older than they should have been. At first I thought it was some kind of delayed death effect. But no, the passengers had signs of advanced aging. Deep wrinkles, brittle skin, and graying hair. It wasn't just a slow process either, it was rapid. In the span of what I could only guess was minutes, the aging had accelerated to a horrifying extent. Then there was the frostbite. In the middle of the desert, where temperatures were climbing well into the 90s, their extremities, fingers, toes, ears, were covered in dark, necrotic patches of frozen skin. The frostbite didn't make sense. There was no reason these people should have had frostbite, especially in a place so hot. We found a few survivors. A flight attendant named Marissa was barely conscious, and a man in his late 30s named Daniel was suffering from severe dehydration, but otherwise seemed fine. Neither of them could explain much of what happened in the moments before the plane disappeared, but the few details they could provide were chilling. Marissa had been in the cabin when she felt the plane shift, like a sudden, unnatural tilt. She couldn't say why it happened, but it was enough to throw the passengers into chaos. The plane, as she described it, seemed to stop midair, as though it was suspended in some invisible force field. Daniel, a passenger in 14B, reported seeing the same thing. He said the plane slowed to an almost standstill, then shot forward again at breakneck speed, so fast that the seatbelts felt like they were tearing into him. Then, as the turbulence became unbearable, he said he saw it, a city, flickering in and out of existence, almost like a hologram formed from static. He said it was on the horizon, huge but far away, with shimmering towers that seemed to dissolve every time he blinked. He wasn't sure if it was real. Before they could make sense of what was happening, the lights in the cabin flickered. Then they vanished. The wreckage was found many miles from where the plane should have gone down, near a dry riverbed. The survivors had been found outside the wreckage, confused and disoriented, with no memory of what happened after the incident in the air. They didn't remember the crash itself, nor did they have any recollection of how they got to the desert floor. I started looking at the flight data recorder to find some clue as to why the aircraft's systems failed. But when I reviewed the data, it showed no obvious mechanical failures. The autopilot was engaged when the last transmission was made. The instruments were functioning perfectly until the final moments. Then they shut down, all at once. But the truly unexplainable part was the time. The flight had only been airborne for 2 hours when the last transmission was sent. Yet by the time the wreckage was found, only 5 hours had passed. Something wasn't right. It was like the plane had experienced an instantaneous shift, a time dilation effect, or worse, like it had somehow slipped out of normal space for a short period. I consulted experts in both physics and atmospheric phenomena. We looked into the theory of temporal disturbances, a strange occurrence where time and space might temporarily distort due to rare electromagnetic fields in the atmosphere. But none of the reports we found seemed to explain the speed at which the passengers aged. That was something different. I returned to Marissa and Daniel to ask more questions, But something had changed. They were no longer the people I had spoken to the day before. Their faces had aged rapidly overnight, just like the other passengers. Their skin was starting to wrinkle, and their hair was thinning. It was as if the moment the crash occurred, they too had been pulled into whatever strange phenomenon had caused the aging. I can't explain what happened. The wreckage, the static city, the time distortion, it all pointed to something much larger than I could comprehend. The theories ranged from secret government experiments in time travel to otherworldly entities manipulating the laws of nature. But no matter where I looked, there was no conclusive evidence to prove anything. What I do know is that those who survived, including Marissa and Daniel, had witnessed something so far beyond the natural world that I couldn't find words to describe it. And whatever it wasn't done with us yet. The investigation is ongoing, but the reports keep piling up. Strange sightings, more disappearances, and now others claiming to have seen that same city of static. I've seen the data, and I've spoken to the survivors. But I can't shake the feeling that we're all just being watched by something that exists outside of our understanding. We may never know the truth, but one thing is certain: the static city is real, and it's out there, waiting to be found. Story 2. It was supposed to be a routine case. A couple of strange disappearances in a small town on the outskirts of Virginia. Nothing unusual, nothing that couldn't be explained away by the usual suspects. But when I arrived, I knew something was off. The air in the town felt thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I'm not one for superstition, but the stories people were telling me sent a chill down my spine. It started with a few reports of strange children showing up at people's doors late at night. Not just any kids, though. They were odd, unnervingly so. Their eyes black as pitch. No whites, no pupils, just solid, glossy black. They'd knock on doors, always asking to come inside, and if the homeowners refused, something terrible followed. One woman claimed that the children stood at her doorstep, silent for minutes at a time, before they finally said, "We just want to come in." Her sister turned them away. The next morning, she was found dead, her eyes completely black, just like the children's. And this wasn't the first case. It had been happening for weeks, maybe months. As I walked through the town, I noticed the quiet. It was the kind of silence that settles into your bones, the kind you feel when something isn't right, when the world seems to have stopped moving. People locked their doors early now. No one spoke much, and everyone avoided eye contact. The fear was palpable. It was like the town itself was trying to forget what had been happening, trying to push it out of their minds. I met with the sheriff, who seemed like a decent enough guy, but his eyes were haunted. He told me he'd been investigating the deaths, but every lead he followed turned cold. The bodies were always found in the same condition: eyes blackened, faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. It was as if life had been drained out of them, but there were no signs of struggle, no physical wounds, just the eyes. The eyes were the only thing that linked all the deaths together. I asked the sheriff about the children, but he looked uncomfortable. He said there were rumors, stories that went back generations. No one really knew where the kids came from or what they wanted, but there were whispers of a cult, something ancient, something that had once thrived in the woods surrounding the town. A cult that had disappeared long ago, leaving nothing behind but their twisted rituals and dark history. I decided to check out the locations where the deaths had occurred. The first house I visited was dark and quiet, its front porch light flickering in the wind. The homeowner had been found dead only a few days earlier, and the family had packed up and left in a hurry, abandoning everything. I stepped inside and immediately felt it, a coldness in the air that seemed to seep into my skin. It didn't take long to notice the photographs on the walls. They were old, faded, black and white pictures of families. Most of them were unremarkable, but one stood out. It was a group photo taken decades ago with a dozen or so children standing in front of a large, crumbling building. But it wasn't the building that caught my attention. It was the eyes of the children. Even in the faded photograph, their eyes were unmistakably black, just like the ones the witnesses described. I ran my fingers along the edges of the photo, feeling a shiver crawl down my spine. The rest of the house was empty. No clues, no signs of forced entry. Just a hollow, oppressive silence. I left quickly, my mind racing. The photo felt like a key to something larger, something buried deep beneath the town's history. That night, I walked through the woods on the outskirts of the town. The trees were dense, their branches tangled like a web, blocking out the moonlight. There was something wrong about these woods, something that made every step feel heavier than the last. It was like the air itself was thick with secrets. I came across an old stone foundation hidden among the trees, half covered in moss and overgrown vines. It was the remains of an abandoned building, too old to have been part of any modern structure. I didn't need to search long. I could already feel the dread sinking into my gut. I found what I was looking for beneath the rubble, an old weathered book. It was bound in something that looked disturbingly like human skin. The pages were brittle and torn, but I managed to make out a few words, names, dates, symbols. The text spoke of a cult that had once worshipped a being they called the One Who Sees. They believed this being was an ancient extraterrestrial entity that could manipulate reality itself. The cult had performed ritualistic sacrifices, using the blood of children to summon their god. The children were believed to be vessels for this entity, and their black eyes were a mark of possession. The more I read, the more the air around me seemed to grow colder, heavier. I could almost feel something watching me, something ancient and malevolent, waiting for me to finish reading. I left the woods as quickly as I could, but the fear had already taken root. There was no explanation for the children, no rational reason for their appearance. But what I had uncovered, what I had read, was far worse. These children weren't simply showing up. They were being drawn here, summoned by something old, something alien. They were the vessels for an entity that had once walked this earth, and it was calling its followers back. The next death came a week later. Another family, another set of black eyes. I knew then that there was no stopping it. The children had come, and the cult had awakened, and they were just the beginning. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if anyone can stop it. But I can tell you this. The children are still out there, and the thing that waits behind their eyes is real. Story 3. I've seen a lot of strange things in my years as an investigator, but nothing quite like the Denver family. The case started simple enough, just another missing person, a small-town mystery, the kind I've dealt with dozens of times. It began with a call from the sheriff in West Virginia about a teenager who'd found a body while hunting in the woods. The body of a baby, buried in a shallow grave, deformed and barely recognizable. No one in the town seemed to know who the child was or why they were buried in such an odd spot. That's when I was called in to investigate. The town was quiet, almost too quiet. People here kept to themselves, and when I asked around, no one seemed particularly shocked or disturbed by the discovery. The sheriff was the only one who seemed a little rattled, but he just shrugged it off. Probably just some drifter passing through, he said, his voice flat. But something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. This wasn't the first time something strange had happened in this town. There were rumors, always whispers of weird things happening around here. That's when the name Denver came up, the Denver family. Apparently, they'd lived in the area for generations, in an old rundown farmhouse on the outskirts of town. No one really talked about them, but everyone knew who they were. The local townsfolk had long whispered that the Denver family was different, strange. No one had ever seen them interact with anyone outside their family. They didn't go to church, they didn't go to the store, and they certainly didn't go to town meetings. The Denvers were isolated, and the rumors about them ranged from bizarre to downright terrifying. The Denver farmhouse was exactly what you'd expect. It sat on the edge of a small hill, looking like it had been forgotten by time. The wood was rotting, the windows cracked, and a smell, a rancid metallic stench, hung heavy in the air. As I approached, I could hear the faint sound of something like a low humming coming from inside. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I was about to leave when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. A man, tall and gaunt, appeared in the doorway. His eyes were wide, almost too wide, and his face was pale, as if he hadn't seen the sun in years. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice soft, almost too soft. "We're investigating a case," I said. "A body was found in the woods. We're looking for any information that might help." The man stared at me for a long moment. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up. "Don't know anything about that," he said finally, his eyes never leaving mine. "You won't find anything here. Best keep moving." I knew he was lying. Something about the way he spoke, the way his eyes flickered to the side. It was too obvious. But I didn't press him further. I thanked him and walked back to the car, my mind racing with questions. The next day I returned. This time I wasn't going to leave without answers. I drove to the house alone, hoping to catch a glimpse of something that could explain the odd behavior of the Denver family. When I reached the farmhouse, the door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open without hesitation. Inside, the place was dark, musty, and filled with the unmistakable smell of decay. The walls were covered in old newspapers, some dated back decades, others more recent. There were pictures scattered everywhere, family photos that looked like they had been torn from the wall and shoved into corners. But it wasn't the photos that caught my attention. It was the bones. On the floor, scattered across the living room, were animal bones. Dogs, cats, even larger bones I couldn't identify. In the corner of the room, a small fire was burning, and I could see something roasting on a spit. Before I could make sense of it all, I heard the sound of movement upstairs. Quick, heavy footsteps, like someone was pacing. I drew my gun and made my way up the stairs, every step creaking under my weight. At the top of the stairs, I saw them. Two men crouched in the hallway, their backs turned to me. They were wearing rags, their faces gaunt and hollow, just like their fathers. Their eyes were unnaturally large, their mouths stretched in tight grins. As I stepped closer, one of them turned, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. A long, sharp tooth protruding from his gums, yellow and jagged. "Don't move," I said, my voice tight with tension. But it was too late. The man lunged at me, moving with a speed I couldn't have expected. I fired twice, the shots echoing in the small, cramped hallway. The man fell back, but before I could react, the other one was on me. I struggled, but there was no stopping him. He was too strong, too fast. His breath was hot against my face, and his teeth, those sharp, grotesque teeth, snapped at my skin. I managed to push him off just long enough to get my bearings, and I fired again, hitting him square in the chest. He collapsed to the floor, twitching, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found next. Behind the walls, hidden in the floorboards, were more bones. Human bones. A collection of them. Children's bones. The Denver family had been, well, I don't know what they were doing, but it wasn't normal. There were signs of cannibalism, of rituals that didn't belong in any civilized town. The rumors were true. Incest, cannibalism, and worse. They had been breeding for generations, keeping their bloodline pure in the most horrifying way possible. When the authorities arrived, the Denver family was gone. We searched the woods for days, but there were no signs of them. It was as if they had melted into the earth, leaving nothing but the rotting farmhouse behind. The sheriff sealed off the property, but I know what I saw. I can't unsee it. Now every time I close my eyes, I hear those whispers again. The same low hum from the farmhouse. The same laughter that echoed from the walls. And I wonder if they're still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the next person to wander too close. But I won't be the one to find out. Story 4. It started as something small. A few odd reports, no one thought much of them. Just a couple of strange happenings, things that didn't quite add up. But as time passed, the incidents began to pile up, and the truth became undeniable. Something was wrong in that little suburban neighborhood. At first, I thought it was a typical case, maybe just a few people dealing with sleepwalking or some kind of mass hysteria. People said they'd seen their neighbors walking down the street in the middle of the night, eyes wide open, but they weren't responding to anything. They were moving like zombies, slow, deliberate, but not really there. They didn't recognize anyone, didn't even acknowledge the presence of others. Most disturbing of all, they were performing strange, almost ritualistic actions. One woman, Mrs. Carter, was found in the park late one night, kneeling by the fountain, placing small rocks in a perfect circle around her. Another man, Mr. Finch, was spotted in his backyard, digging small holes in his garden under the pale moonlight. No one could explain it. I was assigned to the case after the local police became overwhelmed. The pattern was undeniable. People were sleepwalking, performing strange, cryptic rituals, and no one could figure out why. What got my attention was the children. Within weeks, a handful of them went missing. Quiet suburban kids who simply vanished without a trace. And the worst part? No one saw or heard anything. It was as if they disappeared into thin air. I was called in as an investigator, but the deeper I went, the more confused I became. The residents, who had once seemed so normal, now looked like something out of a nightmare. No one wanted to talk, not openly anyway. They'd say they were scared, but their eyes would always dart away, like they were hiding something, some truth they couldn't face. I went from door to door speaking with the neighbors, but no one had a solid lead. Some said it was just stress, that it was a fluke. Others whispered about something worse, something dark hanging over the neighborhood. But they never elaborated, and I never pushed too hard. It was clear that whatever was going on, no one wanted to bring attention to it. One night, I decided to take a different approach. I waited until the dead of night, when the neighborhood was still, and then I went out on foot. I wanted to see for myself. I walked down the street slowly, past rows of houses with darkened windows, when I saw them, the sleepwalkers. At least I assumed they were. A group of 3 people, all walking in sync, all with that same glazed-over look in their eyes. Their movements were jerky, stiff, as if they weren't quite in control of their bodies. They shuffled down the sidewalk, stopping in front of a mailbox. I stayed hidden behind a tree, watching. They didn't notice me. They didn't seem to notice anything. One of them, an older man, reached into the mailbox, pulled out a handful of dirt, and started rubbing it between his fingers, staring at it like it held some kind of power. The woman beside him dropped to her knees and began scribbling strange symbols on the sidewalk with chalk, her hands shaking but precise. The third person, a teenage boy, just stood there staring blankly ahead. My heart started to race. This was no ordinary sleepwalking. It felt wrong, disturbing, like something was controlling them, manipulating their every move. I kept my distance, waiting for them to leave. As they shuffled off into the night, I turned and made my way back to my car. I couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker was at play. The following days didn't bring any comfort. The missing children's cases piled up. I did everything I could to track down leads, but it was like trying to catch the smoke with my bare hands. The police had found no evidence, no sign of struggle, nothing to explain how or why they disappeared. It was as if they had simply evaporated. I started connecting the dots between the sleepwalking, the strange rituals, and the missing kids. I remembered something that had been mentioned to me in passing. A local pharmaceutical company, one that had been conducting trials on sleep-inducing drugs in the area. It wasn't widely known, and when I dug deeper, I realized there had been very little information about the trial's progress, and even less about its side effects. Something wasn't right. I started tracking down former employees of the pharmaceutical company, but most of them had been quietly let go, with no real explanation. A few had moved away. Some seemed almost too eager to forget they'd ever worked there. But one former lab assistant, a young woman named Jenna, agreed to meet with me. Jenna was terrified, shaking when she spoke. She confirmed my worst fears. The drug trials had been a front. The real purpose of the study wasn't to help people sleep. It was to push the boundaries of the human mind. They had been experimenting with inducing altered states of consciousness, tapping into something darker, something that could manipulate the human mind beyond simple sleepwalking. And it was working. Too well. The sleepwalkers weren't just sleepwalking. They were being driven by something far more sinister. The rituals they were performing were part of some kind of subconscious programming, something the drug had unlocked in their brains. They were trying to summon something that couldn't be explained. And the missing children? They were the next phase of the experiment. The drug wasn't just manipulating the adults. It was reaching out to the children, drawing them in, luring them into whatever dark force was being awakened. I didn't sleep for days after that meeting. I kept going back to the neighborhood, hoping to find something, anything that would make sense of it all. But it was too late. The sleepwalkers had grown more aggressive. Their movements weren't just strange anymore. They were violent, chaotic. And the children? They were still missing, their faces fading from the memories of the residents like they had never existed. I couldn't stop it. No one could. The drug, the rituals, the disappearances, they were all part of something too big, too horrifying to understand. In the end, the neighborhood was abandoned, shut off from the world, but the memories remain, lingering in the quiet, dark streets. And sometimes, when the night is still enough, I swear I can hear them, those sleepwalkers, moving in the shadows, still performing their rituals, still searching for something, still waiting. Story 5. I never wanted to believe in monsters. Monsters are for bedtime stories, for campfire tales, for scaring kids into eating their vegetables. But there are things out there, things that don't belong in any storybook. I learned that when I met the crawling man. It started with disappearances. At first, nobody noticed because they were spread out over weeks, and the victims didn't seem to have anything in common. A factory worker one week, a college student the next. The police thought it was a coincidence. People leaving town, runaways, maybe even drug-related. But then the bodies started showing up. They were found in strange places, rooftops, basements, inside sealed closets. The first one was discovered in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. A sanitation worker found him stuffed inside a vent, like someone had tried to shove him out of sight. The autopsy made the case infamous. The man's organs were missing, heart, lungs, kidneys, everything. But there was no clear sign of how they'd been removed. No surgical tools, no clean cuts, no evidence of a struggle. The medical examiner said it was like the organs had been scooped out by hand. More bodies followed. A young woman was found wedged into a crawl space under a strip mall. A bus driver turned up inside the locked trunk of his own car. Every victim had the same story. Hollowed out, empty, with no explanation for how it had been done. That's when I was called in. The first thing I noticed about the crime scenes was the smell. I've been to a lot of murder scenes in my time, but this was different. It wasn't just the smell of decay. It was sharp, metallic, almost oily. The second thing was the pattern. The bodies were always found in tight, enclosed spaces. Vents, crawl spaces, attics. It didn't make sense. There were no drag marks, no signs of forced entry. It was as if the victims had just appeared in those places, already dead. I started digging through old police records, trying to make sense of it. That's when I found something strange. The same type of killings had happened before, 30 years ago, in the same city. People vanished, their bodies showed up in impossible places, and their organs were missing. Back then, the case had gone unsolved. But the strangest thing was what happened 30 years before that, and 30 years before that. The same pattern over and over, going back as far as the records did. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with a person, not in the usual sense. As I dug deeper, I uncovered old newspaper clippings and police reports. One name kept appearing: Elias Crowder. Crowder had been arrested in 1943 after a rash of murders eerily similar to the ones I was investigating. Witnesses described him as strange, hunched, with limbs too long for his body and skin that seemed to hang loosely. He was eventually committed to the Fairhaven Asylum, a notorious institution on the outskirts of town. The asylum's records were still intact, buried in the city archives. They revealed that Crowder had been anything but a normal patient. He claimed to be over 150 years old and said his survival depended on consuming human organs. According to the doctors, he showed no signs of aging during his time at the asylum, which only fueled their curiosity and fear. Crowder escaped in 1952, and after that, the killings stopped, until 30 years later. One night, I got a call from a janitor working in an old office building downtown. He claimed he'd seen something crawling around in the air ducts, something too big to be there. I drove out to meet him, half convinced it was nothing. The building was ancient, the kind of place that felt alive in its own way. The floors creaked under my boots, and the fluorescent lights flickered in the corners. The janitor was waiting in the lobby, pale and shaking, but by the time I got there, he'd decided he didn't want to talk. He handed me his keys and left without a word. I started my search in the basement. The smell was there again, faint but unmistakable. It led me to an open vent, the cover hanging by a single screw. I shone my flashlight inside and saw scratches along the metal walls, like something with claws had passed through. I climbed into the duct. It was tight, claustrophobic, but I had to see where it led. The farther I went, the stronger the smell became, until it felt like I was breathing it in, letting it soak into my lungs. That's when I found the nest. It was a small room at the center of the building, hidden behind layers of ductwork and broken pipes. The walls were lined with scraps of fabric, newspaper, and bones. Animal bones, mostly, but there were a few human ones mixed in. Finger bones, ribs, a shattered skull. In the center of the room was a pile of organs, half decayed and glistening under the beam of my flashlight. And then I saw it. At first I thought it was a shadow. It was crouched in the corner, perfectly still, its limbs too long and thin to belong to anything human. Its skin was gray and mottled, stretched tight over its bones like an old leather glove. It moved suddenly, unfolding itself like a spider, its arms and legs bent at unnatural angles, and its head tilted toward me, revealing eyes that were too small and too dark, buried deep in its skull. I froze. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It didn't move toward me. It didn't need to. Just looking at it was enough to paralyze me. I don't remember how I got out. One minute, I was staring into those awful, empty eyes. The next, I was back in my car, gasping for air. The nest was gone when I returned with backup. No bones, no organs, no sign that anything had ever been there. But the smell lingered. Over the next few weeks, the disappearances stopped, and the case was closed. Officially, it was marked as unsolved, but I know better. I can't explain what I saw. I don't know where it came from or why it was here, but I know it's still out there, waiting, watching, crawling through the dark spaces we try to ignore. And I know it will be back. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.